Today's guest is Chad Carson, who invests in real estate to create a life of abundance and freedom. Welcome to Richer Soul, Life Beyond Money, the last baby step. Imagine it's 12 months from now, and you've achieved your major goals. How does it feel to be in the best shape of your life? To wake up energized, full of energy, excited about the day? What's it like to have great relationships and friends who support you? How does it feel to have an excess of money? To be able to do what you want, when you want, how you want? Imagine being connected to the universe and have it provide everything you desire. Your past does not dictate your future, and the only thing holding you back from this is you. If you haven't listened to episodes 1 through 9, I encourage you to go back and listen to the framework behind Richer Soul and how to create that balance in your life. I help people live the life of their dreams, and you can see how on richersoul.com by looking under the coaching call tab to hear actual coaching sessions. You can also find the show notes for this episode at richersoul.com. I've started to send out a monthly email, and you can sign up while you're there. In the short monthly email, I'll share the best articles of the month, let you know about the upcoming episodes, and share a little wisdom I've learned during the month. I also share the most interesting articles I read every week on Facebook at facebook.com/richersoul. It's harder to keep wealth than it is to make it. Once you come up with a system to create wealth, you need to come up with a system to keep it. If you'd like a second opinion on your financial plans or are worried about missing something, check out the SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. You can learn more at richersoul.com/SWOT. Shout out to our international listeners in Canada, the UK, and Germany. And also within the US, Florida and Texas. Both states have a lot of listeners. Thanks for listening. Would love to hear from all of you. Today, we're going to have another show on real estate. I have a couple more coming up in the next few weeks. The reason I like real estate is that everyone needs a home, so you have an instant market to sell into. In addition, there's so many ways to get involved with real estate that everyone can find their niche if they choose to. You can have real estate business part-time, on the side, or full-time. Real estate provides cash flow during life and retirement that is inflation adjusted, and if done properly, can allow you to live life on your terms. Today, we're going to see the journey of someone who has done just that. Chad began real estate investing from scratch right out of college in 2003 at the age of 23. Since then, Chad and his business partner have bought, flipped, and rented hundreds of properties in and around Clemson, South Carolina. They currently focus on buy and hold rentals and private lending that produces regular monthly income. Chad focuses on using real estate income to retire early and do what matters. For example, in 2017, he traveled with his wife and 2 young daughters to live in Ecuador, South America, and that's where he is when we're recording this show. He also enjoys working on local community projects. Before investing in real estate, Chad graduated from Clemson University, where he's a Rhodes Scholar finalist and the 2-year captain of the football team as a linebacker. Let's meet Chad. Welcome to Richer Soul, Chad. It's great to have you join us today.
Thank you, Rocky. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's always a pleasure. So we always start at the beginning. What was it like when you were growing up, and how much did your family and school teach you about money?
My father was an entrepreneur, so I feel like I was fortunate to see kind of behind the scenes of a person who not only had success, he actually had some failures in some his businesses and some struggles and challenges. And I think that was very informative for me, just in terms of business and money as well, because I saw that there's an ebb and a flow and up and a down. And My mother was a medical professional. She's a dentist. And so she had her own small practice that, she started when I was born, right about the time I was born. And so she and my father together built that up. Definitely had money. We did well, and my family did well. And so it wasn't like never had a need for money or lack of money. But I think the biggest gift I got from my upbringing was that it was a pretty transparent conversation about money. That's why I say I won the very lottery, because there was never kind of a taboo. We had conversations about it. Some of the losses my dad had in some of his business, I actually talked about some of those numbers. And when I was 12 years old, got to see that. And my father got into real estate investing when I was in middle school or so. And so I wasn't that happy with helping him out with it at the time, but he let me go and clean out some of his foreclosure houses that he bought. And he would drop me and my brother off at a house, and it'd just be this nasty furniture everywhere and trash and the refrigerator full of old food. And he'd drop us off during the summer and say, "All right, boys, I'll be back in about 4 or 5 hours. Get this kitchen cleaned up." And then he would take off. And I said, "Oh man, what is this?" And, it was just nasty old food in the refrigerator. And we were sort of saying, who in the world would ever do anything like this? I would never want to do this. And, you never say never, because I ended up doing that myself later on. That was sort of the summary of what it was like for me with money and business growing up.
That's an interesting story. You were lucky, because most people didn't have such a great upbringing with money and so much transparency. And so from that standpoint, it's quite different, which is probably why you've had so much of the success that we're going to talk about today.
We sort of grabbed onto it and eventually came back around and said, our parents are pretty smart, and let me try to learn from them as mentors as opposed to going in the opposite direction. So yeah, I'd say it was very fortunate.
So what are you doing differently to teach your kids about money?
I think there's a couple little things, and I'm still evolving. My kids are 4 and 6 years old, so I'm sort of playing around with some ideas. But the main thing, and I'm not sure this is different actually, but I know I'm trying to be deliberate about it, is just some of the fundamentals of work ethic, and also this awareness of resources is something I'm trying to instill in my kids. Just the fact that, hey, this toy didn't come out of nowhere, this food didn't come out of nowhere. I mean, even I think one of the rituals we have before every meal that I think is helpful in that respect, we just have a little, say thank you. Sometimes it's just saying something you've always said, or sometimes it's saying, hey, what are you thankful for today? Who have you helped today? So kind of having this idea that, hey, this food we have on the table, this money we have in our lives, all of this stuff is something we have to be thankful for and not take for granted. So I think if that kind of attitude, that gratitude kind of foundation, does so much in business and does so much in when you have wealth or when you don't have wealth. If they could have that kind of attitude and grow up with that, all the tools and techniques and specific things, I hope they'll want to learn, and we can learn along the way. But sort of that kind of fundamental attitude part is what I'm trying to focus on as much as I can.
And I think when you look at life from a standpoint of gratitude versus expectations, things dramatically shift, and you just find your way through much, much easier.
Absolutely.
That type of thing. So you have a tagline on your website. It says, invest in real estate, retire early, do what matters. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Do you think you've retired early yet? Are you still getting there? And then what does do what matters mean to you?
Retire is such a loaded word, isn't it? You and we talk to a lot of people about money. And so retire is one of those words that has its own connotation for people. But the way I define it, and so I think I have reached a state where I could call myself retired by my own definition, is that I'm not, on a day-to-day basis, most of my decisions aren't made around me having to pay the bills. For me, early retirement or retirement at whatever age you're at, and then connecting that with doing what matters in your life has sort of been my aspiration as an entrepreneur. I started right out of college. I got into real estate investing. In college, I was a biology major and German minor, so I kind of thought I was going towards the medical school route or maybe teaching biology or doing something like that. But I had this itch to have a little bit more autonomy in my life. I just didn't like the idea of having 7 or 8 more years of school and then having to pay off a bunch of debt. There's just something about it that sort of repulsed me a little bit. As I look back on it, it was this idea of having autonomy and flexibility and freedom to pursue what matters. Pursuing what matters has changed a lot. When I first started as an entrepreneur, buying and selling houses and trying to buy some rental properties, for me, as a single guy in my 20s, I love to play basketball for 2 hours in the middle of the day when everybody else still had to go back to work. That to me was like the ultimate definition of doing what matters, because I could go exercise and had a community of friends and I was doing things. It was just unusual. I didn't have to wear a tie to work. And it's evolved now with kids for us now being married, traveling and spending more time with my kids, getting to teach, write, and help people, whether I make money at it or not. You and I both know when you write a post or a blog post or a podcast, nobody's sending you money for that typically, but the reward is that is helping somebody and that comes back to you. And I think that's been my idea of retirement, is to move sort of a gradual, kind of like you're climbing up a mountain. Every time you move up, you're getting a little bit more autonomy. The percentage of your day that you're doing things that are on purpose and that are fun and that are exciting to you gets bigger and bigger and bigger. For some people, that happens within their job. So maybe they've hit a great spot early on. But for other people, I think a lot of people, even if they love their job, at some point the schedule, the obligations, the fact they have to be there to make money begins to get old. And so a lot of my mission with my website is to try to give people tools, specifically with real estate investing, because that's been the tools I've used, but there are a lot of tools out there to try to gain that autonomy. But along the way, which is why I love your website so much, your blog and podcast, is try to figure out what it is that you want to do. Money's just a tool. So what matters to you? What do you want to do with your life? Do you want to travel? Do you want to start a nonprofit? Do you want to start a business? That excites me. I love hearing those stories and what matters to people. And then let's go use the money to figure out how to help you do that.
And that's what this is all about. And it's exciting to be able to share that and offer people a different opportunity in life, to be able to say no to what everyone else has said and to find your own path and to climb your own mountain. And you have to pick your own mountain, not someone else's, because it might not be the one you wanted.
That old saying that you've been climbing a ladder, it's been put up against a business ladder, and then you realize that the ladder was up against the wrong building. You've been climbing up somebody else's building instead of your own. That to me is a depressing idea.
I don't know if you've dealt much with this, but I find a lot of people don't know how to pick the right building, where they don't even think about it. It's just like they show up one day and someone puts a building in front of them and they just start climbing on that one.
Yeah. What
have you found, or do you have any advice for people on how to make sure they're on the right ladder?
I think it's a great question. And I've had an opportunity to think about it primarily in my own life, because I've taken the way I've been able to think about it is by taking a step back somehow. And so I've had these little, not my term for it, but I've taken these mini retirements along the way during my business. So about in 2009, kind of in the depths of the Great Recession, we kind of buttoned up the hatches in our business, and we took a 4-month trip to Spain. And for me and in our business and what we had been doing up to that point, it was a chance for me to step back and say, am I really building the right thing? Is this business that I'm doing of buying and selling properties the right thing? Is the way we're doing it the right thing? And I think those pauses, whether it's 2 weeks, whether it's a month, whether it's, I'm on a 1.5 year sabbatical right now where I'm just taking a step back and not growing and not in my business as much. I think those opportunities are really helpful. I know, at least in my own experience, a lot of the people I went to school with in high school and college, particularly the people who are kind of the achievers, if your whole life, starting in kindergarten, you're pushing. Let's get good grades, and let's go to a good school. And then when you go to a good school, let's go to a good grad school. And then when you go to a good grad school, get a good job. And then you keep moving up this ladder until one day you realize, wait a minute, I didn't really have much say in any of that. I think at some point, whether it's just whatever shakes you up a little bit. For me, it was those trips and those taking a step back. I think those kinds of moments where you might not change anything. You might realize that, hey, I like the path I'm on, but you might make some subtle changes. You might start saving more money. You might realize that, I'm making $100,000 a year at this job, but I don't think I want to do this 5 years from now. So let me start saving $50,000 a year to try to give myself a cushion and some flexibility. That's where the money comes into the life equation. That if you know the building you're putting your ladder up against, and you actually deliberately think about it, then money can be a tool for you. You can use money to do whatever you want. But I think sometimes we lose that imagination that we had when we were a kid. What do you want to be when you grow up? And if you lose connections with that, then the kind of the default is just to keep going like you always say. Oh, well, I'm just going to keep working. I'm going to keep doing this. I don't need to save that much money. Everything's fine, because you don't have that thing that's pushing you, that why, that motivation. Having a clear idea of that makes everything else sort of fall into place.
It does. When you know where you're going, it's much easier because you know the direction. And if you tell the world what you're doing, people will help you find your path. You don't get distracted by all the shiny objects that are out there that distract you from going the direction you want to go. I always tell people you have to build wealth. You have to save money because life is going to throw you curveballs. When you have a financial base, it may hurt, but you can go through it, and it's just a matter of writing a check versus having massive ruins because you had no base to pull from, which is a shame.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And one of the kind of themes I try to hit on a lot when I'm in my writing is there was a story about Aristotle, and I don't know if this is true, but I've heard the story that he coined it's called the golden mean. So Aristotle, back in the Greek philosophy time, said that every virtue you have, everything that's good in life, could have an excess and a deficiency. So you have too much and too little. An example would be courage. If you have too much courage, you're rash and you go jump off a cliff without a parachute. That's stupid. But if you have too little courage, you're a coward. You stay in a corner and you never try anything. And I've always felt like money is the same way. Like you said, if you're very irresponsible with money and you don't do anything with money, you're going to have a rainy day and you're going to be completely beholden to money at that point. You're going to have to work a job. You're going to have to do something you don't like. But if you go on the opposite end of the spectrum, which I think a lot of us get there and don't realize it, is you put too much emphasis on money. Money becomes so important that it drowns out all the other things that were the purpose in the first place. And so that magical place that I don't know that we ever reached that, but it's finding that balance point between the golden mean of money, not too much, not too little, but finding that sweet spot. To your point, the only way you can really identify that is having your own self-awareness to know, why am I doing this? What's important to me? What do I want to do with my life? Then you can use money to sort of find that balance point between where it's right for you.
You said you're on a mini sabbatical right now. Where are you living and what are you doing?
Our home base is in South Carolina, Clemson, a little college town in South Carolina near the Appalachian Mountains. But we took off at the beginning of this year, so it's been about 11 months now, because we're talking in November, to Ecuador, to Cuenca, Ecuador. My wife and I both like to speak foreign languages. We particularly like Latin America and Spanish. And so we've traveled to Latin America in the past, but it was pre-kids. And so we really wanted to have our young kids have an experience of living abroad. And we wanted to have an experience living abroad as well, an extended experience where we have an apartment here, we're living here, we're making local friends, kids go to local schools. They're speaking Spanish. They had about 3 or 4 words when we got here, and now they're speaking Spanish. And so it's just been a great experience. It really is sort of like I talked about earlier. It's slowed our lives down, and it's made it just the rhythm has been much more deliberate. We eat a lot of meals together. We go out to the park a lot. We have local friends who you spontaneously get together with. So it's just been an enriching experience. Amazing for us.
That sounds like a lot of fun. And I would assume a lot of people would probably have fear of moving to a country like that from the standpoint of health, safety, and other types of things. What have you found?
It's kind of like getting into a hot water bath. You do one toe at a time. You just get a little bit at a time. We've in the past, we've traveled to Mexico a good bit and to Costa Rica. And so, we didn't jump in like going on a year-long trip right off the bat, but everybody has sort of their comfort level with research. And we looked at several different countries. We liked Argentina. We liked Spain. We liked Ecuador. We liked Mexico as well. Ecuador is one of these countries, relatively small, about 15 million people. They've actually done a really good job with their infrastructure. It's still a developing country in some ways, so there's still some things that aren't as, if you're used to creature comforts, but in the U.S., for example, it might not be exactly the same, but we live in a city called Cuenca. You can drink water out of the tap, relatively safe. You still want to be careful here and there for, pickpockets or things like that. But it's not something we've been worried about. But I would just say if somebody's considering that, go on some trial trips, go on a 2-week trip somewhere, a vacation, and kind of check a place out, do some reading. There's all sorts of travel blogs and things you can look at. And then you can just sort of learn how things work. How do you go there? How do you get a visa? How do you deal with food? And one of our favorite parts about being here is instead of us going and driving to the grocery store, there is a grocery store we can walk to nearby, but we walk to the open market. Fresh fruits and vegetables are so inexpensive here. You could spend $10 or $15 and get this enormous mound of vegetables and fruits and salads, and you can cook your meals. And so it's a very healthy lifestyle as well in terms of this. If you can get a lot of fresh produce and things that would be a lot more expensive in the U.S.
What are some of the comfort things that you miss that aren't available there?
We're living pretty comfortably. We live in a comfortable part of town. And I think if we had done this trip 10 years ago, I would have been much more, or 15 years ago, much more disconnected, because the internet is much easier now to connect with people. I'm sitting here talking to you in the U.S. just like I would be in South Carolina. So I've stayed pretty connected, and that has not been uncomfortable. I think if I didn't have internet, me personally, I'd go through some withdrawal pains. I think, for me, the biggest thing is we really had to simplify our lives, and we sold a lot of stuff and a lot of our personal stuff just so we could store it. And we rented our house out for a couple of years. And I think my little pet thing that I love is I like having physical books. And so I've got a big bookshelf at home with all sorts in it. To me, I almost have a relationship with a book. The author, I've been talking to the author, and he's kind of a mentor. She's a mentor to me, and I like to write in the books. And so I've been having to do all these Kindle digital books here. That's hard for me. So that sounds kind of silly, but that's my main comfort that I miss, is having my books that I can pull off the shelf.
What happened to your happiness level when you simplified your life?
Definitely went up. I thought it would happen, but I like to read the Transcendentalists. I have a little book of Walt Whitman poetry by my bed, and Thoreau. So they're kind of heroes of that philosophy of mine. But I've never really done it for myself, where you cut life down to the bare bone and you see what really matters. And for us, it's really been that way. We got here to Ecuador with 3 suitcases, I think. You have 10 pair of clothes, and you have, the kids had to pick a couple toys that they brought with them. And it hasn't been a drop of reduction in happiness. It's actually been much, much happier, because a lot of the things that we didn't get to emphasize as much, those family meals that I was mentioning earlier, my wife and I get to take walks, and exercise together. In fact, exercise is a big part for us, walking and going to the park. I play basketball here, pick up basketball. I found my games here. So there's all these things that I think sort of get overlooked when you're busy with stuff. You're always you have a big house and you got to take care of things, that you can focus on some of those things that maybe when you were in college or high school, you kind of look back nostalgically, say, oh yeah, back then I used to play pickup basketball, or I used to take walks, or I used to go I used to see friends randomly on Friday afternoon. It's like, well, why don't we do that? Well, what's getting in the way? It's usually, for me at least, it was obligations. I was over involved in different organizations. I was, there were good things local, but I was on the planning commission of my town. I was on this board and that board, and I was on this volunteer thing, and 2 businesses. And so not only simplifying material stuff, but simplifying this, how many things are you involved in, and what is that taking you away from, has been such an eye-opening concept for me, being here.
And what's the difference in cost of living?
Definitely cheaper. So I'm in a cheap part of the U.S. I'm in a small town, but so we probably spend, I'll give you real numbers. We were at $4,000 a month. It was our budget back in Clemson once we had kids, and we're a little bit under $3,000 a month here. So, but we could be a lot cheaper. We go out to eat, we have fun, we're not skimping. We have an apartment that we could have probably been 100 or 200 lower if we got a long-term apartment, but we have a certain place we want to be in. So yeah, $2,800 to $3,000 a month in the city, in a more expensive city in Ecuador. We're living pretty well.
All right. I wasn't sure how dramatic the cost differential was between the two.
One of the big ones, and this is another kind of rabbit hole topic, but something I talk about a lot with expats here, people who are living abroad. Healthcare is one of the biggest issues, and it's actually been one of the most positive. We have for $30, even if you didn't have any health insurance here, you could spend $30 to have an MD, so an actual doctor, come to your apartment. Our kids had an infection, a throat infection. We called the doctor, they come, and we had insurance here, which cost $165 a month, by the way, for private health insurance for the family. So we have a copay. So we pay $10 a month for that doctor or $10 per visit for that doctor to come. That to me, more than any other thing, there's food differences, there's housing differences, but the enormous cost of healthcare in the U.S. versus here, that's been the biggest budget buster for us because I'm an entrepreneur. I'm not working for anybody else, so I pay for my own healthcare for our family. We were on the healthcare exchange for I think it was $1,100 a month for a $13,000 family deductible before we left, and I think this year it probably would have been $1,400 or so. I mean, here we are paying $165 a month for almost no deductible and getting good quality healthcare.
And that's important. That's one way to beat the system, right?
Yeah, you can move.
You can move. And that's, people need to make choices and decide what's important to them. So you still own real estate back home?
I do, yes. So we have a business partner and I have a portfolio of rental properties back home.
How do you manage rentals long distance? Or is it because you have a business partner back home?
He's actually more passive, so I'm still more in the management of the business than he is. He's still involved, but the way we've done it is it's been a process, but I think it's a combination of systems and then putting good people in good places. So we don't have like a big operation. We don't have an office outside the house or anything like that. But over the years, I have a bookkeeper who started off as a bookkeeper, and she checked the mail and helped us pay bills and do things like that. And she's kind of grown into a role where she has helped me do a lot of other things. So while I'm here, for example, she manages about 2/3 of our properties. So we have a turnover. We have a checklist that I created that I used to do myself, but now she goes out, and when the tenant moves out, we do our walkthrough. She checks all these things. We call the contractor. The contractor comes, does this. He has a checklist. And so it's all those systems and checklists that kind of help out for every part of the business. Then I also, a lot of the technology has helped me. So she'll do all of the preliminary work when we have a tenant who's interested in renting our property. She gets all the information for the application, calls the old landlords, and then I have the application sitting in front of me here in Ecuador. And so that doesn't happen that often because we don't have that many turnovers, but I'll make that final decision. I'll look at all the information. It's all online. I'll say, okay, that looks good, or no, that doesn't look good. That doesn't meet our criteria. I can do that from a distance. I can also, if she has a question on there's some kind of weird repair that we normally don't do, I'll help call a contractor or do something from here. I probably spend, because it's kind of systematized now between her and we have a third-party manager, another manager who manages some other properties we have. I spend a couple hours a week usually on Thursday and Friday, just kind of doing some of that, paying some bills, handling some things like that. It's gotten to that point where I can do it. The time I do spend, I do it from a phone and computer.
That's what happens with real estate. Up front, you have to put a lot of work in, but over time, you systematize it, you figure out what's important, and you have other people help you get things done, and then you can make a lot of money with very little time and effort on your part at the end.
Absolutely.
Just out of curiosity, when you look at renters, what are you looking for and what are your red flags?
Good question. So early on, I did it wrong. I didn't have like set criteria. And I think that's my biggest recommendation to anybody is to have quantifiable criteria. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is because it's the law. You're going to get yourself into trouble if you start going on gut feelings and saying, oh man, I think that person's a good person or not, because you actually need to have like numbers. And so the numbers I use, I have a few different important ones. Number one is I want to see what their income ratios are. And so this is very similar to getting a loan. I look at their debt to income ratio, meaning like when you add up the rent they're going to be paying me plus all of any other debts they have, like on a car, student loan, whatever, credit card. When you add those up, those need to be below a certain number. And I don't have those numbers right in front of me, but I think we have kind of two tiers based on lower price rentals and then higher price rentals. I think it's like 40% or so would be the cutoff. So if they have debt payments over 40% of their gross income, they don't qualify. It's cut and dry. There's no arguing about it. There's no discussing it. That's just what it is. We also look at gross income. So if on a lower price rental, if the rent's $1,000 and they don't make over $3,000, that doesn't work. Those are kind of some easy cutoffs. You can ask somebody up front before you even do an application, hey, how much do you make a month? And the rent's $1,000. If they say $2,500, you say, well, you're not going to qualify for this one, unfortunately. I'm sorry. We have another property for $500. Why don't you take a look at that one? That's number one, income. Number two is we look at credit, a cutoff score, depending on the rent for the property. And so if it's below a certain number, this doesn't qualify. But I've heard a banker say this, and I think it's pretty accurate. In the past, I used to not think it was as important, but it's basically a proxy, not necessarily for whether they're like a good person. The people who are good people make mistakes with their credit, but it's a proxy to see how responsible they've been with their money in their recent history. If somebody has 5 years ago had a bankruptcy, but for the last 5 years has done really well, typically that's going to be reflected in their credit score. And so we're not as high as a bank has to be, but I still want to see that they've been working at having a responsible financial history. And the third thing that I take really seriously as well, references from prior landlords. Because you could look at all the money stuff and somebody's really responsible with their money, but then they treat their property really poorly, or they always bring in pets even though they weren't supposed to have pets, or they just tear the house up and they leave that landlord hanging. So we get we like to have at least two. If you talk to just the prior landlord, they might be able to tell you a story just to get rid of their bad tenant. But if you go back to the prior landlord and talk to them, we get a written reference from them and have them say, did they pay the rent on time? Would you rent to them again? Did they treat the property well? Were there any issues you had? We asked like 3 or 4 questions to the old landlord and just get an idea. And we've had some where they said, yeah, no, they left us owing $700. I wish I could get that money back from them. And it didn't show up anywhere else except for that conversation with the landlord. And so we did not rent to that person.
You have to do your due diligence. I always say that, that's the decisions. Do the right work up front and make the right decision with your tenant. And then later on, it's much easier. I think real estate is all about doing your work up front. When you go to buy a property, it's doing the work up front, your due diligence. When it's putting a tenant in, it's do your due diligence up front.
Yep.
And it really eliminates a lot of the problems down the road.
You're exactly right. I like to tell like a mistake I made early on, and I think a lot of people make this with causing them not to do their due diligence, is particularly with tenants, is you have this property that's vacant, and you're so impulsively and rightfully so, you do not want to have a vacancy where you're having to pay money out and you're not getting any income coming in. You have this prospect here who wants your property. And usually the worse they are as a prospect, the more motivated they'll be. They're like, I got to move in now. I want to move in right now. I'm ready. And here you are, you're ready because you want to get some income, and they're ready because they want to move in. That's the worst thing you can do, is to rent to that person who's ready to go right now, because this goes back to having some financial reserves and having some financial foundation. Is that in the times of my business where I was too motivated by getting some cash in, like today, I made poor decisions based on over the long run. I put a tenant in there who ended up, I knew my gut feeling, oh man, I made a mistake with this person, or oh yeah, their credit score was 30 points below, but I'll still work with them. And that person ended up, not paying us, or they tore the property up, or something happened. So I think having a financial base, a good, having an emergency fund, both personally and in your business, every rental property you have some reserves for that rental property, so that you can then be patient up front and do your due diligence and then make the right decision. That's been a big game changer for me.
And you need reserves in all parts of life. That helps. It takes away the need to have to do something you don't want to do or to make a bad choice. And so as long as you have those reserves, you have the ability to do that. If you were looking at someone starting out today and they wanted to get involved in real estate, what would you see as the easiest, quickest path to get started?
Good. You've asked the question that lets me get up on my favorite pedestal. So it's going to depend on your age and your kind of family situation. But if you were just getting started and you were willing to be a little flexible and hustle, I think the best way to get into rental properties is by actually making your residence your investment. And so let me explain what I mean by that. So there's 2 different ways. One way is something that in the real estate industry we call a house hack. So a house hack means for example, you buy a duplex and you live in one side of the duplex and you rent out the other side. And so you can pay for some, or in some cases all of your mortgage payment by just getting a tenant on the property you're living in. And there's so many advantages to doing that, whether it's a duplex or whether it's a house with a basement apartment, or in my case, I lived in a quadruplex, one of my first houses when I was in my 20s. I lived in one unit of the quadruplex. My total principal, interest, taxes, and insurance were about $1,050 or so per month. And I had $1,200 coming in from my 3 tenants in the other units. And so I was living definitely for free, but maybe a little bit positive. I had some money I could put in the bank every month to help pay for maintenance and repairs and things. And so that's one of the biggest advantages, is that when you're building wealth and you're trying to buy rental properties, you're kind of killing 2 birds with one stone. You're able to reduce your living expenses. You're able to learn the rental property game. You're able to get into the game with an owner-occupant mortgage instead of having to go out and get investment mortgages, which are much more difficult to get. And so you have all of that synergy, and you're starting right. And then later on, a couple years later, you can move out of that property and keep it as a rental, which is what I've done. I still own that quadruplex, and it's been a great rental for me. So that's called house hacking. That's kind of one wrinkle. The other wrinkle that I would say, kind of the other side of that coin, is doing the same thing, but just do it with a single family house. So move into a house, you live there with your family, but make sure it's a house that eventually could be a rental property. And so you're not buying like the big dream house. You're buying a nice, simple house that you can, maybe it's a fixer-upper, you can do some work to and make it low maintenance, and make sure that the numbers would work that once you move out to be a rental property. And so you live there as long as you want to live there, maybe let's say a couple of years, and then you move out and keep that as a rental property. I think those 2 angles, from what I've seen from people getting started, it sort of takes away pressure and the angst of having to step out into the investment world, because it's sort of a hybrid. You got to live somewhere, the same process you would normally get to have a mortgage. And it's easy to make mistakes when you're living there. I didn't know how to be a landlord when I first started. Nobody did. And so you're learning, and you can cover some of those mistakes because you're there. And then you learn a whole lot while you do that.
Let's talk about some of those key ratios. If I were to buy a $100,000 house, how much rent should I get per month?
The general rule of thumb, and I'm not sure if you use this one too, Rocky, it's just the 1% rule is kind of just a starting point. I don't use that as my kind of end all be all, but the 1% rule means that if you have a house that you could buy for $100,000, it should rent, in order to get some basic cash flow, you probably want to have about $1,000 per month in rent. That means 1% of the price you're paying is the amount of rent per month. So 1,000 is 1% of 100,000. That's a good starting point. Some markets, if you're in a really high price market in San Francisco, that's going to be impossible to do. If you're going to be in some markets, that might not be good enough. Some parts of Detroit, for example, that you might want to get even better than that. I like that to start, but then from there, it's kind of like that's the first pass. If I'm just looking at a bunch of properties, if it doesn't even meet the 1% rule, or potential to meet the 1% rule, I'm not interested. From there, I'll use a couple different ratios. I also like to buy it with a margin of safety on the price. I'm not saying I'd never pay full price for a property, but if the full value is $100,000, I don't want to pay $100,000. I at least want to have, even if it's a good property, a 10%, 20% discount. Although I've bought properties at 30, 40% discounts as well. It just depends on how much you're hunting and looking for deals. I think that gives you a little bit of room in case you make a mistake, in case something changes in the market. It gives you a little bit of cushion as well.
Comes back to margin. Have margin in your life so you can handle the ups and downs that are going to be there.
That's that theme. We keep coming back to that theme, don't we?
It's funny. It doesn't matter who I talk to or what we talk about. The same themes come up across the board. If you can learn that set of principles, it doesn't matter what you're doing. The same principles always apply. Are there certain types of real estate that you think are more desirable to buy? In other words, multiplexes versus single family versus something else?
I'm sort of agnostic in terms of like what type, single family versus multifamily. I think there's advantages and disadvantages to both. I'm particularly inclined towards residential property. My kind of reasoning is, and this is again long-term kind of risk and conservative nature, I think there's less fluctuation in the residential market than there is in the commercial market. And I'll just give you an example. Like we bought our first commercial property last year, and it's a retail space in a really busy road in my little small college town. So I think it's good. It's got upside potential. It's right next to a park. So I had to look at a lot of things though to understand why that property would be valuable. But what if technology's changing so fast? What if Amazon completely wipes out every retail store? I don't think that's exactly going to happen, but it's happening. Retail stores are not. So commercial property has the potential to change a lot, whereas residential property, yes, there are fluctuations. Yes, rents go up and down. Yes, prices go up and down. But I have never heard, even when I've talked to people who, when I was younger, who lived through the Great Depression, I've not heard of a time, if you have a property that's in a generally good location where there are actually jobs and there are people living, wanting to live there, where you couldn't lower the rent at some point and get the house full or get the apartment full. And I like that. That feels conservative to me because I know that I have a sort of a backdrop. Even in some really bad situations, I've even talked about like, all right, if we had Great Depression number 2, let's just do this like mental exercise. And people didn't have a lot of currency in their life. They didn't have a lot of cash. If I had 10 units, I could rent one unit to the handyman who would fix up all my properties. I would rent another unit to the person who has some chickens and some crops that they could sell me some food. I'd rent another house to, on and on and on. I mean, you could do some bartering if you had to. And so I like that about residential real estate. I think it's a kind of generally in demand commodity. And if you buy it correctly, if you buy it with a good income, it has all that kind of protection and downside, plus it has a ton of upside as well.
And it does have upside as long as you can. I like to pay the rentals off fast. So the faster I pay them off, the faster they turn to cash flow. And part of that is my age. I'm 52. And so I would prefer to have the cash flow versus 30 years of debt because I'll be 82 then. And I don't want to be in debt at 82.
Exactly. No, I'm with you. I'm more inclined to that as well. I go back and forth on what debt level I want, but when I first started, I was definitely more aggressive, but I was also aggressive with a backstop. I used a lot of seller financing, and I used a lot of private money, and I always had a really low loan to value. And so, but at some point, you want to kind of, I've never understood talking to a lot of other real estate investors who wanted to stay in debt their whole life. At some point, don't you want to make your life a little bit easier and safer and growth for growth's sake. Growth is just a tool, like we talked about earlier. Why are you wanting to grow? I'm wanting to grow to do this with my life. If you have some big thing that you want to grow for, yeah, all right, great, keep growing. But at some point, what my recommendation to most people is kind of get to these plateaus. So buy 5 properties, get them paid off quickly, and if you want to buy another 5 properties, do it again. But instead of buying 10 properties and then keep all of them leveraged, why not kind of take a chunk out of them? Get those, get a nice little 5 property portfolio that's safe and cash flowing, and then you'll have that money and you can go do it again. And that's a much safer way to grow. And it seems slower to some people. It seems more deliberate, but it's the tortoise wins the race, right? That's the way it works.
Absolutely. And there's been many famous people like our president and Dave Ramsey who have both gotten burned in the real estate market. And I know people locally who have as well. They overextend themselves and they have no margin. And when things go bad, their entire portfolio gets foreclosed against. And that's what happens when you're in massive debt. Someone else gets to make your choices.
That's right.
So you mentioned private money, seller financing. Can you elaborate a little bit more of how that works?
Sure. So I sort of lucked upon it, not even lucked upon it. I had to use it because when I first started investing, as I mentioned before, I had no job. I was a full-time entrepreneur, which when you step into a bank, that means you're unemployed. And so for me, I did get some bank loans when I first started when I was 23, 24, but the only way I got the bank loan was I had a partner, a gentleman who was my business professor at Clemson University where I went, who signed on the loan with me. That was the only way I got a bank loan. So I did a little bit of that, but I had a cap on that. And so what I had to do by necessity was I became the person who found good deals. And then I went to people like that professor and a few other people and say, all right, I can find deals that are really good. They're below value. They have good cash flow. Is there a way we can do business together where I could buy this deal? And I kind of looked at it like, all right, I love sweet potato pie. And here's the sweet potato pie. I found it, but I got to buy it and I don't have any money. And so I'd rather have half of that pie, or I'd rather have a quarter of that pie than not having any pie. That little pie principle has worked really well because when you look at a deal, as long as you know how to identify pies, which in real estate means you identify a good deal that has good cash flow, that has good potential to resell it, you understand that and you're willing to hustle and go find it, then you can go find money to partner with you essentially. And the way I partnered was typically with debt. And so, for example, my professor friend, he was my earliest private lender. He had a 401k or IRA and 401k kind of money that was sitting idly, and he had some in the stock market, but he was more inclined to invest in real estate. But he wasn't as interested in doing all the dirty work like I was willing to do. And so what I would do is I would find the deal early on. He would loan me the money, and these were buy and flip kind of properties: buy it, fix it, flip it. And so maybe 6 months, 9 months would be what it would take to flip it. He would loan us the money, and then we would pay him a 10% interest rate, which is, looking back on it, it's pretty high compared to what I pay now. But that's the pie principle, that I was about to go make $30,000 or $20,000 on this flip. And so if I had to give him, he loaned me $100,000 to do that. So if I held it for 6 months, that's $5,000 in interest. And so I'm giving a piece of my profit to him, but I'm able to do the deal. And now I'm able to make $20,000. That's how I got started. He would use his IRA money, and you can self-direct that. There's some certain custodians you roll the money over to those custodians, and they'll allow you to then loan your money to a person like me or somebody else who's trying to flip a house or buy a rental property. And so he became my bank just by having some of his capital that he had built up over time. So he would be the bank instead of being the rental property guy. So he didn't have to go out and collect money, or for a flip, he didn't have to go out and manage contractors and do all that. I did that. He received an interest check. It sort of evolved from there to where eventually I started just trying to keep more properties. And so I couldn't afford to pay 10% interest, but he was happy with 6% interest. And so we would do a longer term mortgage where I would pay him 6% interest on a 30-year amortization, and I'd have to pay it all back by 15 years, for example. He would be able to get that passive income, because these days, he was getting 0.5% in the bank, or 2% from a bond, or 2% dividends in stocks. And so he was very happy with getting a 6% return with a solid piece of collateral, with a solid person that he knew and trusted. It just worked really well. I did that. I've done it. I kind of had a small circle of people like that who would loan their money. And then it evolved to where I would do the same thing with sellers, where I'd have a gentleman he had owned a property for 30 years. He was a landlord. He was tired of being a landlord. And he and I would talk, and he would have this idea of this price he wanted. I would be down here. I said, if I'm going to pay you cash, I need to pay this. And I might be $10,000 below what he wanted to be. But he would say, all right, well, I would propose, well, what about this? This is a long-term property for me. I'm willing to pay a little bit more if you'd be willing to let me pay you $10,000 down, and then I'll pay you this much per month at 4% interest for the next 25 years or 30 years. And so I had some sellers who, very similar to my private lender, they were going to have to take that money and go invest it somewhere else. They might not accept that with everybody, but after I got to know them, we trusted each other, and they saw that I had a plan. It was a nice transition to them to go from being a rental property owner to basically owning an annuity or a cash flow income stream where I did the work, I managed the tenants. I had a series of relationships like that where it's a slow game. It's not something you can just go on the MLS and make a bunch of offers. Hey, will you sell or finance this property to me? It's more of a face-to-face, get to know somebody type thing, like it used to be. Like people, you actually got to know each other and actually did business together. And it's probably been the number one aha for me. These relationships between people who have money and people who are out finding deals, and how synergistic that can be, has been one of the best, most helpful parts of my entire business. It's been great.
I talk about the importance of relationships, and this is just one more example of how building relationships, helping other people, and then kind of changing the terms of the deal that it becomes a win-win for both of you. Mm-hmm. It creates that opportunity for you both to be happy with the results that you're looking to achieve.
Exactly.
And it also shows another way to get involved in real estate if you don't want to handle the phone calls and deal with the tenants and all the other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any types of people that you would look at and say, you know what, real estate's wonderful, but real estate's not for you?
Yeah, plenty of people. I talk to a lot. I mean, people, I think you probably get the same question, but people say, tell me why I should do real estate. And I say, well, maybe you shouldn't do real estate. I see a common theme among people who are successful with real estate, and typically it comes down to a couple of things, but one of them is they like control and they like to influence their investments. So, the other side of that coin is like to have control and influence means you have responsibility and you have to make decisions. And so there's some people who are much better with just being behind the computer, spreadsheets, let me buy my dividend stocks and let me be patient and run my numbers. Real estate's a people game. You don't have to do a ton of stuff. Like right now, I'm a couple hours a week I'm involved, but it's a thing where you have to make decisions on a regular basis. If you're not comfortable with that, then it actually, not even if you're not comfortable, if that's not a good thing. Like if you're not excited about the fact that you can influence your investments, I think real estate's not right. I think it's definitely hands-on when you first buy the property. It can be very passive later on, but even though it's passive, you got to keep an eye on it. You got to think about it. And I like that. I like the fact that I understand what I own. I understand it's there. It has real value. It's like I mentioned earlier, in a Great Depression, I know that I could go trade chicken eggs and food for rent or, somebody to do some work. Like I have something that I understand and it's simple to me and I can get involved. But there's some people that's just not exciting at all. And so I would say those kind of people, that doesn't excite you, don't worry about it. And you don't necessarily need to, I'm not a repair person. Like I can tear stuff up with a sledgehammer, but I can't put anything back together. So like you don't have to be a handyman fixer-upper person, but you got to get involved somewhere. Like I got involved in the negotiations and I got involved in the numbers and I got involved in the management. I never got involved in the fixing up that much. I did a little bit of painting here and there, but you got to choose somewhere where you're going to add value. And that's the benefit of real estate is that it's not like the stock market where, Rocky's investing in that stock and I'm investing in that stock. His money is as good as mine. There's no competitive advantage there. It's a commodity. Real estate's completely different. You can get in there and your personality and your trustworthiness and everything else you have as a person could actually make a difference. And I find that exciting, but for some people, that's not their game.
You have to know what your skill sets are. You have to know what you're good at, what you're not good at. So self-awareness, which I think is we mentioned earlier, and then find the part in the places within real estate where they intersect and they work well together, and you can bring that additional value that someone else can't bring to that situation, whether it be capital, knowledge, or the ability to bring the deal together, or to see something that others don't see in a way to get more out of a property than somebody else might be, because it's a different path to take, something a little bit unconventional.
That's right. Yeah, and it's fun. It's like a puzzle. You're an entrepreneur. I mean, you're very much, you're an investor and an entrepreneur at the same time. And so you got to find that niche, like you said, where you're going to add value. And as a financier, as a manager, as a fixer-upper, as a entrepreneur who has vision for a neighborhood, I mean, there's all sorts of different angles you can get into, but you definitely need to find that niche. That's another thing I try to emphasize with people is you can't just be a real estate investor. You've got to be some kind of, at least initially, you got to go into a niche. You got to go into a niche market. You got to go into a niche type of investing. Are you a note investor? Are you a rental investor? Are you a flipper? And even within note investing, are you a discount note investor? Are you a hard money lender? Are you, a passive, note buyer? I mean, so there's all sorts of niches. And so that'd be a due diligence item if somebody's just learning is like, which one of those resonates with me the most? Which one of those connects with my skill set at this moment? And then find a way to get involved in that and learn and do it.
You've been through some ups and downs because you got in 2003, which was a massive upswing in the market from 2003 to like 2007, 2008. Yep. Then you went through a massive crash. And after that, we've rebounded, clearly not gone back to where we were. Thoughts, advice on how to go through all those different types of markets and what to watch out for?
Yeah, every market has its own sort of puzzle pieces to put together. When I was in 2003 and 4 and 5 and 6, when I first started, it was very much like it is right now in terms of it's very competitive to find deals. And so I think the biggest challenge that all of us face in these markets is to stay disciplined, is not to catch up in the euphoria of, I got to get in, I'm going to miss out. There's that balance point. You don't want to be so conservative that you never get in the game. I kind of believe more in, cost averaging over time. You're not going to buy your best deal in 2006 and 7 compared to 2009 and 10. But if you don't get in the game and you start trying to pick times too much, I think you're going to have a hard time ever getting in deals and buying properties. So I think, but there's a discipline. And so it goes back to those fundamentals and the margins. Figure out what the margins are for you. Don't just buy any old deal. Buy deals that have the margins. And if you feel like you're beating up against the wall like you do in a competitive market where everybody's out overpaying what you want to pay, go back to those niches. Try to find a little niche. Try to find a little angle. Think outside the box. Stop thinking just on numbers. Think, how can I add value here? How can I add value to a seller? How can I add value to a property? What's missing? You gotta think a lot more creatively in a competitive market. So I think that's where we are, as we're talking right now, it's back to that stage. The other thing that we sort of did, again, I guess intuitively, but it saved our hide, was we were buying and selling a lot in 2004, 5, and 6, and we pushed it too much. We bought too many properties. But the thing we did, we bought and sold and made some good money, but we still kept living like we were in college. I was living in my house hack. I was saving money. I didn't spend much money. I played basketball in the middle of the day, which was free. There was no money I was spending on cars or stuff. I didn't feel like I'd arrived. And so we had pretty big reserves going into 2009 and 10, and 8, 9, and 10, and we needed them because we had some properties that we bought that were poor choices that were either in the wrong location or had negative cash flow, or had some repairs that surprised us, and we had to drop $10,000 or $20,000 on some stuff that we didn't think we would have to. And so we kind of had to survive that for a few years and just hustle and kind of maneuver and change the way our approach. Instead of flipping houses, we actually got into owner financing some houses. So we would have some where we would become the bank, like I was talking about earlier. We would do that for buyers, for tenants, and they would make down payments to us, and we would carry the terms for them. And so that was another reason having private money was advantageous, because we could talk to our private money lenders and say, here's our plan, here's what we'd like to do. Are you okay with that? And we could all work together to adjust to the market and what was going on. And so I think those are some of the first thing I said was just staying disciplined and having some margins that you stick to. The second part is reserves, making sure, go back to that again. And then third part is just, you got to be ready to pivot. Entrepreneurship and investing is such a changing game. And, I don't know what the next downturn is going to look like. I know there will be a downturn, but it's not going to be exactly like it was in 2008 and 9. There's going to be differences. And so it's sort of having this willingness to be flexible and nimble. And I think that's one of the biggest advantages that we have as small entrepreneurs. So many people get worried about, oh man, these big hedge funds are buying all sorts of properties, and these big, huge, REITs, and people are, how do we ever compete with them? They have more money than we do. Well, we're small, we're flexible, we're nimble. We can turn, if things change 3 months from now, we can change our whole philosophy about real estate investing, next week. And so that having that willingness to throw out the old and throw out your ego a little bit and say, hey, that didn't work, I got to try something new, is one of the biggest advantages we have as small entrepreneurs.
Absolutely. There are the opportunities. And that's kind of one of the things is when you go against the big guys, you do have certain advantages over them, and you need to exploit those advantages. And it doesn't matter whether it's the stock market, the real estate market, the retail market, whatever it is. Don't just think because they're the big guy, they win. There are things the big guy can't do well, and that's where you need to be the expert, and that's where you need to focus on where you can beat them and win. And so there's opportunity there.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Is there anything that we should have covered with real estate today that we haven't talked about, or life in general?
I love your questions. You've gone in a lot of good directions. I would just think going back to sort of the beginning, I talked a little bit about, why you do this and, retiring early so you can do what matters. I think real estate's a great tool for that, but whatever your tool is, I think go back to that balance point and try to have some self-awareness and ask questions, take a break if you can, like I talked about, to get clear on where you're going in life, because I find this such a fun game. Investing and entrepreneurship can be so fun when it's infused with a purpose. Making money for making money's sake and the techniques and those kind of things, they're interesting over time, but it's the mixing it with how, money is like a board game that is real life. This isn't Monopoly. This is like when you buy a property or you buy a stock or you buy whatever you're doing, you're actually affecting your life for the better if it's sort of on purpose and if it's going in a certain direction. And so I think you and I, Rocky, are on the same page with that and our missions and what we're trying to accomplish. And that to me is like the purpose on why I'm out here. I get a lot of joy out of somebody hearing about seller financing or realizing they can do a house hack, knowing that person is taking a step of getting a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more autonomy, and it's just a progression. Something that keeps getting better and better in time if you look at the long game. But the long game is life. It's enjoying it, it's contributing, it's finding your voice, and that's the opportunity that I feel so fortunate to be able to do, is that I'm doing what I want to do now. I'm not talking on podcasts or writing articles because somebody's making me do that, or even it's not. I need to do better with making money. I'm really not making that much money either, but it's a place that I feel so fortunate because it's fun. I'm enjoying it, and so I want everybody else to be able to do that. And it might not be writing articles, but it might be taking care of your kids more. It might be traveling, and it's going to change over time, and that's exciting to know that we all have some control over our own destiny by learning and getting better.
Absolutely. And I wake up every morning excited for the things I'm going to do that day. It doesn't matter whether it's Monday or Saturday. It's always about getting up, being excited about what I'm doing. When you can create that, essentially, whether it be the cash flow or the financial resources that allow you to be able to say no to anything you want to say no to, and to be able to do what you enjoy regardless of whether or not it creates income for you, it's awesome. This podcast, same thing. The podcast itself doesn't really generate income, but I get to meet lots of great people. I get to have wonderful conversations, and I enjoy learning and doing this, and I enjoy sharing it with others and helping them figure out these things for themselves in whatever unique way it works for them.
It's a good place to be. Absolutely. It definitely is.
So if people would like to find you, learn more about you, and connect, what's the best way for them to do that?
My home on the internet is coachcarson.com. I used to play football in college, and so I kind of stuck with the sports theme. So coachcarson.com is my website, and you can go there. I have a free toolkit if you're interested in investing, where you can kind of get I have a checklist I use for when I close on a property that you can borrow. I have a deal analysis worksheet with all the formulas basic formulas I use, and I have some videos that go through some of the niches that I talked about, some of the basic niches of real estate investing and which ones are better and which ones for you and why. I'd love for you to come there and we can communicate, and feel free to ask questions and leave comments. I'd love to hear from you.
That's cool. And I encourage people, if you're interested in real estate, it's one more resource. There's a lot of free resources there. Check it out, and I will put all of that in the show notes as well.
Great. I appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us today.
Great to be here, Rocky. Thank you.
I encourage you to check out Chad's site, coachcarson.com. He has plenty of free resources that you can take advantage of. So the action step is explore how real estate can fit into your wealth plan. If you're already involved, what other niches can you get involved in? Next week, we're going to meet someone who is about to begin an early retirement and find out how he was able to do so. Is there someone you know who could benefit from what we talked about today? Please share the episode, as it helps you to build social capital and create better relationships and start better conversations with the people you know. They'll appreciate you for it. What's preventing you from moving forward, and who are you putting on your team to help build the life you deserve? Remember, taking no action creates a far worse outcome in life than trying something and failing. Thanks for listening. You can always get me at rocky@richardsoul.com. Have an abundant week.